The candles on my 28th birthday cake flickered in the dim lighting of the Manhattan restaurant as my grandfather Harold smiled warmly and asked, "So, Valerie, is the apartment comfortable?" I blinked in confusion and my fork halfway to my mouth. "What apartment?" I asked, genuinely puzzled. The table went completely silent. My parents, Susan and David, exchanged panicked looks, their faces draining of all color. Harold's smile slowly faded as he turned to them with deadly quiet precision and asked, "Then where did the money go?" The expensive crystal glasses on our table seemed to vibrate with tension as Harold's question hung in the air like a thundercloud. I watched my mother Susan's hands begin trembling as she reached for her wine, nearly knocking it over. My father David cleared his throat multiple times, adjusting his tie nervously while avoiding eye contact with anyone. "Grandpa Harold, what money are you talking about?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The elegant restaurant suddenly felt suffocating with its mahogany paneling and soft jazz music that now seemed mockingly cheerful. Harold's steel gray eyes remained fixed on my parents as he spoke with the controlled calm of a man accustomed to boardroom confrontations. "6 months ago, during our family phone call, you mentioned struggling with rent. Your parents called me the next day explaining how difficult things were for you financially." My stomach dropped. I remembered that conversation. I had mentioned working double shifts at the coffee shop just to make ends meet, eating nothing but instant noodles for dinner most nights. The stress had been overwhelming. "I immediately transferred $50,000 to your parents." Harold continued, his voice growing colder with each word. "Specifically designated for your apartment down payment. I wanted my granddaughter to have security and stability." $50,000. The amount hit me like a physical blow. While I had been counting pennies and walking everywhere to save on subway fare, there had been enough money sitting somewhere to completely change my life. "Dad, Mom, what is he talking about?" I demanded, turning to face them directly. My mother's mascara was starting to run as tears formed in her eyes. "Sweetheart, we can explain," Susan stammered, her voice cracking. "We were waiting for the right time to tell you about the money. We wanted to make sure you were ready for such a big step." "Ready?" I nearly shouted, then caught myself as other diners began to stare. Lowering my voice to a harsh whisper, I continued, "I've been ready for my own place since college graduation. I've been sleeping on an air mattress in a studio apartment with paper-thin walls where I can hear every argument my neighbors have." David finally spoke up, his face flushed red with embarrassment and anger. "We were protecting you, Valerie. Your grandfather doesn't understand what it's like to be young in this economy. We thought it would be better to wait until you had more savings of your own." "Protecting me?" I stared at him in disbelief. "From having a decent place to live?" Harold reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone, scrolling through what appeared to be banking records. The transfer was completed on March 15th. $50,000 sent directly to the joint account belonging to David and Susan Mitchell. My parents' last name hit me like another revelation. The money had gone into their account, not mine, not even a separate account set up for my benefit. "We deposited it safely," Susan said quickly, dabbing at her eyes with the cloth napkin. "We were going to help you find the perfect place, coordinate everything properly." "Let me see the bank statements," I said, firmly extending my hand. "Valerie, this isn't the place for this discussion," David protested, glancing around nervously at the other patrons who were trying to pretend they weren't listening to our family drama. "If you use the money properly, you should have no problem showing me the records." I insisted, my voice steady despite the emotional hurricane building inside me. My parents exchanged another look, and I saw something pass between them that made my blood run cold. It was guilt mixed with fear, the expression of people who had been caught in a lie they never expected to be exposed. Harold quietly signaled the waiter and handed over his platinum credit card without even looking at the bill. The simple gesture spoke volumes about his wealth, but more importantly, about his desire to continue this conversation somewhere more private. I think we should move this discussion to my apartment, Harold said, standing slowly and adjusting his expensive suit jacket. Despite being in his 70s, he carried himself with the authority of someone who had built an empire from nothing. As we walked toward the restaurant exit, I felt like I was stepping out of one life and into another. The warm spring evening air hit my face, but I barely noticed the bustling New York street scene around us. My mind was spinning with questions, each one more disturbing than the last. If my parents had $50,000 meant for me, why was I still struggling? Why hadn't they mentioned it during any of our recent conversations about my financial stress? What else weren't they telling me? Harold's driver held open the door to a sleek black sedan, and I found myself sitting between my parents in uncomfortable silence as we drove through Manhattan toward his penthouse. I stared out the window at the city lights, wondering how many other secrets my family had been keeping from me. The car ride felt eternal, with only the soft hum of expensive leather seats and climate control to break the tension. I caught my mother wiping her eyes in the reflection of the window, while my father sat rigid as a statue, his jaw clenched tight. When we finally reached Harold's building, the doorman greeted him by name and ushered us into a private elevator that required a special key. As we ascended toward the penthouse level, I realized this was only the beginning of what was about to become the most devastating night of my life. Harold's penthouse was unlike anything I had ever seen in person. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a breathtaking view of the Manhattan skyline, while museum-quality artwork adorned the walls. A personal staff member quietly disappeared into the background as we entered the spacious living room, leaving us alone with our family crisis. "Oh, please sit down," Harold said, gesturing toward an arrangement of leather chairs that probably cost more than my entire year's rent. He walked over to an elegant wooden desk and opened a laptop computer, his fingers moving with surprising speed across the keyboard. "I want to show you something, Valerie," he said, turning the screen toward me. The display showed a detailed banking interface with a series of transactions highlighted in blue. "These are the records of every payment I've sent to help support you over the past 2 years." My eyes widened as I scanned the screen. Monthly transfers of $5,000 each one, labeled with descriptions like Valerie Living Expenses, Valerie Emergency Fund, and Valerie Education Support. The dates went back 24 months, totaling over $120,000. "I don't understand," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "I never received any of this money." Harold's expression grew darker as he scrolled through more records. "Your parents contacted me regularly, updating me on your financial struggles. They said you were too proud to accept help directly from me, so they volunteered to act as intermediaries." I turned to stare at my parents, who were now sitting rigidly on the sofa across from us. Susan had stopped crying and was staring at the floor, while David's face had taken on a defensive, almost hostile expression. "You told me Valerie was struggling with student loan payments." Harold continued reading from what appeared to be email correspondence. "Medical bills from a minor car accident. Basic living expenses while working part-time jobs that barely covered her rent." The irony was crushing. While my parents had been describing my financial struggles to Harold, I actually was living exactly the way they described. The difference was that money meant to help me was never reaching me. Mom, Dad, where's all this money?" I asked, standing up and facing them directly. "While you were collecting thousands of dollars supposedly for my benefit, I was eating generic macaroni and cheese for dinner every night." David finally exploded. "We were managing it responsibly. Do you think we should have just handed you a pile of cash? You would have spent it foolishly, and then where would you be?" "Spent it foolishly?" I repeated in disbelief. "On what food that doesn't come from a box, a mattress that isn't inflatable?" Harold clicked through more screens on his laptop. "I also sent additional funds last year when your parents informed me about emergency medical expenses following what they described as a serious illness." "I was never seriously ill," I said slowly, the reality of the deception beginning to sink in. The closest thing I had to a medical emergency was when I fainted at work from not eating enough. Susan looked up with tears in her eyes. We were protecting that money for your future, honey. We put it toward things that would benefit you in the long run. What things? I demanded. Harold's fingers moved across the keyboard again, and he turned the laptop screen toward my parents. Perhaps you can explain why your bank records show purchases for a new BMW, a 2-week vacation to Europe, and a complete kitchen renovation during the same time period you were receiving funds for Valerie's support. The silence that followed was deafening. My parents had been caught red-handed, and there was no way to explain away the evidence Harold had compiled. That's different, David said, his voice rising with anger. We had our own financial obligations. We were planning to pay back everything once our situation improved. Pay back money that was never intended as a loan? Harold asked, his voice dangerously quiet. Money specifically designated to help my granddaughter. I felt like the room was spinning. Not only had my parents been lying to me, but they had been systematically stealing money, meant to help me while watching me struggle. The betrayal cut deeper than I could have imagined. There's more, Harold said grimly, opening another file on his computer. I've been sending monthly payments for what I believed were Valerie's health insurance premiums since your parents informed me she couldn't afford coverage through her employer. I have health insurance through my job at the coffee shop, I said. Weekly, though, the coverage was minimal and had a huge deductible I could never afford to meet. According to your parents, that insurance was inadequate, and they were supplementing it with a family plan. I've been sending an additional $800 monthly for nearly 2 years. $800 a month for health insurance I didn't know existed. Money that could have covered my groceries, transportation, and given me some semblance of financial security. Harold's expression was becoming more disappointed and angry with each revelation. I also provided funds for what your parents described as continued education expenses. Apparently, Valerie was taking evening classes to advance her career. I haven't taken any classes since graduating college, I said, my voice hollow with shock. I can't afford additional education. The room fell silent, except for the soft ticking of an antique clock on Harold's mantelpiece. The weight of my parents' systematic deception was crushing. They hadn't just hidden money from me, they had constructed an elaborate fiction about my life to justify taking thousands of dollars every month. David suddenly stood up, his face red with anger. You're trying to turn our daughter against us, he accused Harold, pointing an angry finger across the room. You've always resented that Valerie chose to live her own life instead of depending on your wealth. Is that what you told yourselves to justify stealing from her? Harold asked calmly. We didn't steal anything, Susan protested, finally finding her voice. We're her parents. We know what's best for her financial future. Her financial future? I laughed bitterly. I don't have a financial future. I'm 28 years old with less than $300 in my savings account and credit card debt I can barely manage. Harold closed his laptop and looked at me with genuine sadness in his eyes. I thought I was helping you build a stable foundation for your adult life. I never imagined... He trailed off, shaking his head. My mother reached toward me pleadingly. Sweetheart, you have to understand. We were going through a difficult time financially. Your father had some setbacks at work, and we needed to borrow against the money temporarily. Setbacks at work? I asked, confused. Dad, didn't you get promoted to regional manager 6 months ago? The question hung in the air, unanswered, adding another layer of lies to an already overwhelming situation. I was beginning to realize that everything I thought I knew about my family was built on deception. Harold walked over to a filing cabinet and removed a manila folder thick with documents. I'm afraid there's much more we need to discuss, he said quietly. And I suspect you're not going to like what you learn next. Harold opened the manila folder and spread several documents across his glass coffee table. The papers were organized with the precision of someone who had spent decades managing complex business transactions. I noticed official letterheads, bank statements, and what appeared to be legal contracts. "Valerie, I need you to sit down for this," Harold said gently, his voice carrying a weight that made my stomach clench with anxiety. I sank into the leather chair, my legs feeling suddenly weak. "How much worse can this get?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to hear the answer. Harold picked up a document labeled Educational Expense Account and handed it to me. "Your full scholarship to Columbia University," he said carefully, "was not actually a scholarship." The paper shook in my hands as I read through the financial breakdown. "I don't understand. The scholarship office confirmed my academic merit award because I arranged for the payment to go through their office to preserve your sense of independence and achievement," Harold explained. "Your parents suggested this approach, claiming you would be too proud to accept direct educational support from family." I stared at the numbers on the page. 4 years of tuition fees, room and board at one of the country's most expensive universities. Nearly $200,000 that I believed I had earned through academic excellence, but which had actually come from my grandfather's generosity. My parents knew about this the entire time. I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "They coordinated everything with my financial advisors," Harold confirmed. "Every semester, they would confirm your enrollment and provide updates on your academic progress." David shifted uncomfortably on the sofa, but remained silent. Susan was staring at her hands, unable to meet my eyes. Harold handed me another document. "Your car loan with the remarkably low interest rate that you were so proud of negotiating." I looked down at the paperwork for my reliable Honda sedan. According to the bank statements, the loan had indeed been for $12,000 at 2% interest, which I had thought was an amazing deal for someone with limited credit history. "I've been making payments to Harold's account, haven't I?" I asked, the pieces falling into place. "Your parents arranged for the payments to be automatically transferred to me while I covered the actual loan amount directly with the dealership," Harold explained. "You were never actually in debt for your car." My sense of pride and financial responsibility was crumbling with each revelation. Everything I thought I had accomplished independently had been carefully orchestrated by my grandfather, with my parents acting as intermediaries. "There's more," Harold said, reaching for a thick stack of insurance documents. "Your health coverage through the coffee shop provides minimal benefits. For the past 3 years, you've actually been covered under my company's comprehensive family plan." I thought about all the times I had avoided going to the doctor because I couldn't afford the copays and deductibles, the dental work I had postponed indefinitely, the prescription glasses I needed but couldn't justify buying. "I've had excellent health insurance this entire time," I asked incredulously. "Complete coverage," Harold confirmed. "Dental, vision, prescription, medications. Your parents were supposed to provide you with the insurance cards and information." Susan finally looked up, tears streaming down her face. "We didn't want you to feel beholden to anyone," she said weakly. "We thought it would be better if you believed you were managing on your own." "But I wasn't managing on my own," I exploded, standing up and pacing across the expensive Persian rug. I was struggling every single day, making impossible choices between basic necessities, thinking I was a failure because I couldn't make ends meet. Harold's expression grew even more grave as he reached for another folder. "I'm afraid the deception goes much deeper than what we've discussed so far." He pulled out bank statements and receipts that made my blood run cold. Charges at luxury restaurants, high-end department stores, jewelry shops, and what appeared to be a casino in Atlantic City. "While I was sending money to support your basic living expenses, your parents were using those funds for their own entertainment," Harold said quietly. I scanned the receipts in horror, dinner bills for hundreds of dollars at restaurants I could never afford, designer clothing purchases that exceeded my monthly income, jewelry that cost more than I made in a year at the coffee shop. "David," Harold said, his voice carrying a dangerous edge. Perhaps you can explain these gambling expenses that coincide perfectly with the dates I sent emergency funds for Valerie's supposed medical bills. My father's face turned ashen as Harold spread out casino receipts and credit card statements showing massive losses at blackjack and poker tables. You've been gambling away money that was meant to keep me housed and fed, I said, my voice shaking with a combination of rage and heartbreak. It wasn't supposed to be permanent, David stammered. I had a system, a strategy that would have paid off eventually. I was trying to multiply the money to give you even more. A system? I laughed bitterly. Your system left me eating crackers for dinner while you lost thousands of dollars at casino tables. Susan reached toward me desperately. We were going to pay it all back with interest. We just needed time to get back on our feet financially. Harold stood slowly and walked to his window overlooking the glittering Manhattan skyline. Time you didn't have, he said quietly, because I'm dying. The words hit the room like a lightning strike. I felt the air leave my lungs as the implications sank in. What do you mean dying? I whispered. Harold turned back toward us, his face showing every one of his 74 years. Advanced heart disease. The doctors give me perhaps 6 months, maybe less if I don't avoid stressful situations. I sank back into the chair as the full weight of the situation crashed over me. My grandfather had been trying to secure my financial future because he knew he was running out of time, while my parents had been stealing that security for their own selfish purposes. The apartment money was my final attempt to ensure you would have stability after I'm gone, Harold continued. I wanted to know you had a safe place to live, that you wouldn't have to struggle anymore. David suddenly lurched to his feet, his face contorted with anger and desperation. This is all your fault, he shouted at Harold. You spoiled her, made her think she deserved things she hadn't worked for. We were trying to teach her real-world responsibility. By lying to her every day of her adult life, Harold asked calmly. You're trying to buy her affection. David continued, his voice growing louder and more threatening. Trying to turn her against her own parents with your money. Harold's security team, who I hadn't even noticed entering the room, stepped closer as David's agitation increased. The men were dressed in understated business attire, but their alertness was unmistakable. Sir, perhaps it would be best if you lowered your voice, one of the security guards suggested politely but firmly. David spun around, realizing for the first time that we were not alone in the penthouse. The presence of professional protection seemed to deflate his anger, slightly replacing it with a cornered animal's desperation. Harold walked slowly back to his desk and opened a different drawer, removing a legal document with multiple signatures and official seals. Valerie, he said sadly, I had hoped to discuss this with you under much happier circumstances, but given tonight's revelations, I think you need to understand the full scope of what your parents have potentially cost you. He handed me the document, and I recognized it immediately as a legal will. My name appeared multiple times throughout the text, designated as the primary beneficiary of assets worth more than I could have imagined. As I read through the inheritance details, I felt Harold's eyes watching me carefully. Then, without warning, he clutched his chest and staggered backward. Harold! I screamed, jumping up as my grandfather collapsed to the floor. The security guards immediately moved to help him while Susan frantically called 911. As I knelt beside Harold, holding his hand while we waited for the ambulance, I realized this was far from over. In fact, the worst was yet to come. The hospital waiting room smelled like disinfectant and desperation. I sat in an uncomfortable plastic chair, my hands still shaking from watching Harold being wheeled into emergency surgery 2 hours earlier. The cardiac unit's fluorescent lighting cast an unforgiving glare over everything, making my parents' faces look even more haggard and guilty. A nurse had explained that Harold's stress-induced heart attack was serious, but potentially survivable with proper treatment. The next 24 hours would be critical for his recovery. I was staring at the vending machine across the hallway, debating whether I could afford a bottle of water when I overheard Susan speaking quietly into her phone near the restroom entrance. "We need to move faster than we planned," she was saying in a hushed, urgent tone. "He's in the hospital now, which might actually work to our advantage. Yes, I understand the legal complications, but we have to get power of attorney before it's too late." My blood turned to ice. Power of attorney. Legal control over Harold's medical and financial decisions while he was incapacitated. I pretended to focus on a magazine while straining to hear more of my mother's conversation. The lawyer said if we can demonstrate that he's been mentally incompetent in his financial decisions, we can make the case that he needs protected supervision. Susan continued, "Giving away hundreds of thousands of dollars without proper oversight could be evidence of cognitive decline." I felt sick to my stomach. They were planning to use Harold's generosity toward me as evidence that he wasn't mentally capable of managing his own affairs. Susan ended her call and returned to the waiting area where David immediately joined her in whispered conversation. I watched them from the corner of my eye, pretending to read an article about celebrity gossip while they plotted against my unconscious grandfather. "The what, Valerie?" David said, approaching me with forced casualness. "We need to talk about something important." He sat down beside me and pulled out a folded document from his jacket pocket. "Given Harold's medical emergency, we think it would be wise to have some legal protections in place for his own good." The document was a sworn statement declaring that Harold had been showing signs of mental confusion and poor judgment in recent months. It specifically cited his reckless financial gifts and paranoid accusations as evidence of cognitive impairment. "All you need to do is sign at the bottom, confirming that you witnessed his erratic behavior tonight," David explained. "It's really for his own protection to make sure he gets proper medical supervision." I stared at the paper in horror. They wanted me to lie under oath to help them gain legal control over Harold's life and assets. "I'm not signing this," I said firmly, handing the document back. Sweetheart, you don't understand how these things work," Susan interjected, moving to sit on my other side. "Sometimes elderly people need family members to step in and make responsible decisions for them." "Harold isn't elderly and confused," I replied. "He's the most mentally sharp person I've ever met. Everything he told us tonight was documented with perfect clarity." David's expression hardened. "He's clearly been manipulated by someone who wants to isolate him from his family. These sudden changes to his will, the accusations against us, the dramatic financial gifts. None of that is normal behavior." I realized with growing horror that my parents had an entire narrative constructed to justify taking control of Harold's life. They were going to paint him as a vulnerable old man who needed to be protected from his own generosity. "I won't be part of this," I said, standing up and walking toward the nurse's station. But my parents weren't finished. Over the next several hours, while Harold remained unconscious in intensive care, I watched them work systematically to build their case. David spoke privately with the attending physician, expressing family concerns about Harold's recent erratic behavior and decision-making. Susan contacted the hospital's social services department, inquiring about procedures for protecting elderly patients who might be vulnerable to exploitation. They were creating an official paper trail that would support their claim that Harold needed legal guardianship. Around 3 in the morning, I overheard Susan on another phone call that made my blood run cold. "Yes, we found the name of a facility that specializes in patients with early-stage dementia," she was saying quietly. "The reviews mentioned that they're very good at managing difficult cases who resist treatment. They were planning to have Harold committed to a nursing home. The important thing is that we get him transferred before he becomes combative again," Susan continued. "If he starts making accusations about the family, it will just reinforce the diagnosis of paranoid delusions." I had to grip the arm of my chair to keep from falling over. My parents weren't just trying to steal Harold's money. They were planning to lock him away in a facility where his protests about their theft would be dismissed as symptoms of mental illness. When David returned to the waiting area, I pretended to be asleep while listening to their whispered planning. The lawyer said we need to file the paperwork first thing Monday morning, he told Susan. If we can get temporary guardianship based on the medical emergency, we'll have legal authority to make decisions about his care. What about Valerie? Susan asked, glancing toward my supposedly sleeping form. She's too emotional to think clearly right now, David replied. Once she realizes how much better Harold's life will be with proper supervision, she'll understand we're doing the right thing. I kept my eyes closed while my heart pounded with rage. They were so confident in their plan, so certain that they could manipulate everyone around them to get what they wanted. But they had made one critical mistake. They had revealed their entire strategy while assuming I was powerless to stop them. As dawn broke through the hospital windows, I made a decision that would change everything. While my parents dozed fitfully in their waiting room chairs, I quietly slipped out of the cardiac unit and found a private alcove where I could make a phone call. I needed help, and I knew exactly who to contact. The business card I pulled from my purse belonged to Margaret Chen, the attorney whose name I had seen on Harold's legal documents. If my parents thought they could abuse the legal system to steal from my grandfather, they were about to discover that two could play that game. But first, I needed to understand exactly what I was fighting for. And that meant learning the full truth about Harold's will, his assets, and just how much my parents had to gain from having him declared incompetent. As I dialed the emergency number on Margaret's business card, I realized the stakes were higher than I had ever imagined. This wasn't just about stolen money anymore. This was about Harold's life, his freedom, and his right to live his final months with dignity instead of being imprisoned by the children who had betrayed his trust. Margaret Chen's law office occupied the 42nd floor of a gleaming tower in Midtown Manhattan, with windows that offered commanding views of the city below. At 8 in the morning on Monday, she had already been at work for 2 hours, reviewing the urgent case I had presented during our weekend phone conversation. I've never seen a more comprehensive case of financial elder abuse, Margaret said, spreading Harold's meticulously organized financial records across her conference table. Your grandfather documented everything with the precision of someone who suspected he might need legal protection. I sat across from her, exhausted from spending the weekend at Harold's bedside while secretly gathering evidence of my parents' schemes. Harold had regained consciousness but remained weak, and his doctors were keeping him sedated to prevent additional stress on his damaged heart. Your parents filed for emergency guardianship this morning. Margaret continued handing me a copy of the court documents. They're requesting immediate legal authority over Harold's medical care and financial assets based on claimed mental incompetence. I scanned the paperwork with growing anger. My parents had submitted sworn statements from David's brother, a notary public, claiming to have witnessed Harold's confused and irrational behavior during recent family visits. They had also included a letter from Susan's friend, a registered nurse, describing Harold's apparent cognitive decline during a supposed medical consultation. Both of these people are lying, I said firmly. Harold hasn't seen David's brother in over a year, and he's never met Susan's nursing friend. I suspected as much, Margaret replied, which is why I spent the weekend conducting my own investigation. She opened a laptop computer and turned the screen toward me. The display showed a detailed timeline of Harold's financial transactions over the past 5 years, cross-referenced with my parents' banking records. Harold has been financially supporting you since your sophomore year of college, Margaret explained. But the pattern of theft began much earlier than your parents admitted. I stared at the screen in shock. The evidence showed systematic financial fraud going back nearly 6 years. According to these records, your parents initially contacted Harold claiming you were struggling with unexpected medical expenses during your junior year. Margaret continued. They requested emergency funds to cover hospital bills and prescription medications. I was never hospitalized during college. I said, my voice hollow with disbelief. The medical expenses were fabricated, Margaret confirmed. Your parents used forged hospital bills and pharmacy receipts to justify taking $40,000 meant for your health care. The scope of their deception was staggering. They had been lying to Harold and stealing from me for years, constructing elaborate fictional crises to justify taking money meant for my support. Margaret clicked through more screens revealing additional evidence. They also convinced Harold that you were struggling with housing costs during your senior year. He provided $30,000 for what he believed was emergency assistance with rent and security deposits. I lived in the dorms, I said weakly. My housing was covered by the scholarship, which was actually Harold's money anyway. Exactly. Your parents were essentially stealing from Harold twice, once through the fabricated expenses, and again by diverting the legitimate educational support he was providing. Margaret opened a filing cabinet and removed a thick legal document bound in blue covers. This is Harold's current will updated 6 months ago. I need you to understand what your parents are trying to steal. I took the document with trembling hands. The first page listed assets worth over $50 million, including real estate holdings, investment portfolios, and ownership stakes in multiple businesses. Harold built his wealth through commercial real estate development, Margaret explained. He owns your apartment building along with 47 other properties throughout Manhattan and Brooklyn. I stared at the asset list in amazement. My grandfather wasn't just wealthy, he was extraordinarily rich with holdings that generated millions of dollars in annual income. According to the current, will you inherit 60% of the estate? Margaret continued. The remainder is designated for various charitable organizations focused on education and poverty relief. 60% of $50 million. The amount was so large I couldn't even comprehend it. Your parents inherit nothing under the current will, Margaret said quietly. Yes, Harold removed them as beneficiaries after discovering their financial deception 2 years ago. The pieces suddenly fell into place. My parents weren't just stealing monthly support payments. They were desperately trying to gain control of Harold's estate before he died, knowing they had been completely disinherited. If they succeed in having Harold declared mentally incompetent, they can contest the current will and potentially restore their inheritance rights, Margaret explained. Elder abuse cases often involve family members claiming that financial gifts to other relatives were the result of diminished mental capacity. I felt sick to my stomach. My parents were willing to destroy Harold's final months, lock him away in a nursing facility, and rob him of his dignity, all to steal money they had already lost through their own dishonesty. Margaret opened another file containing private investigator reports. Oh, I hired a team over the weekend to verify the claims your parents made in their guardianship petition. Every allegation of mental incompetence was fabricated. She handed me photographs showing David's brother at a casino in Atlantic City during the weekend he supposedly witnessed Harold's confused behavior. Additional photos showed Susan's nursing friend at her regular job 300 miles away in Philadelphia, making it impossible for her to have conducted any medical evaluation of Harold. We have evidence of perjury, fraud, and conspiracy, Buds, Margaret said, but there's something else you need to know. She opened her laptop to display banking records showing large cash withdrawals from my parents' account over the past 6 months. Your parents have been taking cash advances against credit cards and borrowing money from potentially dangerous sources, Margaret explained. The amount suggests they have significant gambling debts beyond what Harold's support payments could cover. I studied the financial records with growing alarm. My parents owed money to multiple creditors, including some with addresses in Queens, that Margaret's investigator had identified as possible loan shark operations. If they're desperate enough to risk perjury charges in court, they may be facing threats of physical violence from creditors, Margaret warned. That makes them unpredictable and potentially more dangerous to Harold. The full picture was becoming clear. My parents weren't just greedy, they were desperate people who had gambled away far more money than they could afford to lose. Harold's estate represented their only hope of avoiding financial ruin and possible physical harm from the people they owed. What can we do to protect him? I asked. Margaret smiled for the first time since our meeting began. We're going to give your parents exactly what they deserve, she said. But first, I need you to do something that might feel uncomfortable. She handed me a small electronic device that looked like a typical smartphone case. This is a recording device. I need you to have a conversation with your parents where they discuss their plans for Harold. You want me to secretly record them? Everything they've told you so far has been verbal, Margaret explained. We need documented evidence of their conspiracy to commit elder abuse and fraud. If they believe you're supporting their guardianship petition, they'll likely reveal details about their scheme. The idea of trapping my own parents made me feel nauseated, but I thought about Harold lying unconscious in his hospital bed, vulnerable and trusting that his family would protect him. What happens after I get the recording? I asked. Margaret's expression grew determined. Then we destroy their legal case, expose their crimes to the authorities, and make sure Harold can live his remaining time in peace and dignity. She handed me a business card for the district attorney's office. We'll be filing criminal charges for elder abuse fraud and attempted theft. Your parents' only choice will be to accept plea bargains that include full restitution and prison time. As I prepared to leave Margaret's office, I realized I was about to cross a line that would permanently change my relationship with my parents. But they had crossed that line first when they decided to steal from my grandfather and potentially destroy his life for their own selfish gain. The recording device felt heavy in my purse as I walked toward the coffee shop where I had agreed to meet Susan and David. They thought I was ready to support their guardianship petition after seeing the light about Harold's supposed mental decline. They had no idea they were about to confess their crimes to someone who was finally ready to fight back. The coffee shop on East 63rd Street was busy with the usual Manhattan morning crowd of professionals grabbing caffeine before heading to their offices. I chose a corner table that would provide privacy for our conversation while giving me clear sight lines to both entrances in case I needed to leave quickly. The recording device Margaret had given me was activated and hidden in my purse, positioned to capture audio clearly while remaining completely invisible. My hands trembled slightly as I stirred sugar into my latte and waited for my parents to arrive. Susan and David walked in together at exactly 9:30, their faces showing the strain of the past few days. They looked around nervously before spotting me in the corner, then approached with the careful optimism of people who thought they were finally going to get what they wanted. "Sweetheart, you look terrible," Susan said, sliding into the chair across from me. "Have you been sleeping at all?" "Not really," I replied truthfully. "I've been thinking about everything that happened at Harold's apartment and about what you said at the hospital." David sat down and leaned forward with interest. "You're starting to understand that we're trying to protect everyone involved." I nodded slowly, hoping my expression conveyed reluctant acceptance rather than the disgust I actually felt. "I think I was too emotional before to see the bigger picture." Susan reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "We knew you'd come around once you had time to process everything rationally." "Help me understand exactly what Harold's condition means for our family," I said, careful to phrase my words to encourage them to reveal their plans. David glanced around to make sure no one was listening, then spoke in a low voice. Harold's mental state has been deteriorating for months. The wild accusations, the financial irregularities, the paranoid behavior. It's classic early-stage dementia." "How long have you noticed these problems?" I asked, knowing their answer would contradict the timeline of their own theft. "At least a year," Susan said without hesitation. Maybe longer. We've been trying to manage the situation quietly to preserve his dignity. The lie was breathtaking in its audacity. They were describing symptoms that coincided perfectly with their escalating theft of Harold's money meant for me. What kind of financial irregularities? I pressed. David looked pleased that I was asking the right questions. Giving away massive amounts of money without proper oversight, making irrational decisions about his estate planning. Last month, he tried to transfer ownership of multiple properties directly to you without any legal consultation. I almost laughed at the irony. Harold's attempts to ensure I inherited property fairly were being characterized as evidence of mental incompetence. So the guardianship petition is really about protecting his assets from his own poor judgment, I asked. Exactly, Susan said eagerly. Once we have legal authority, we can make sure his wealth is managed responsibly until he gets proper medical treatment. What kind of treatment are you thinking about? David leaned closer, his voice dropping even further. There's an excellent facility in Westchester that specializes in patients with cognitive decline. They have experience managing people who become combative or resistant to care. The way he said combative made my stomach turn. They were planning to have Harold locked away somewhere. His protests about their theft would be dismissed as symptoms of his supposed illness. How long would he need to stay in a facility like that? I asked. Oh, probably for the rest of his life, Susan said with false sadness. It's heartbreaking, but people with his condition rarely recover enough to live independently. They were sentencing Harold to spend his final months imprisoned in a nursing home, separated from everything familiar and comfortable while they plundered his estate. I'm worried about the legal aspects, I said carefully. What if Harold challenges the guardianship? What if he gets lawyers involved? David's expression grew harder. He's already been making wild accusations about our financial management. If he tries to fight the guardianship in court, it will just prove that his paranoid delusions are getting worse. Besides, Susan added, once we have medical documentation of his condition, his legal challenges won't matter. Courts always side with family members who are trying to protect vulnerable elderly relatives. I felt sick listening to them describe Harold as vulnerable and elderly when he was actually sharper and more capable than either of them would ever be. What happens to his money while he's receiving treatment? I asked. David's eyes lit up with an enthusiasm that revealed his true motivations. We'll need to manage his assets responsibly to pay for his care. Premium facilities are expensive, but there's also the matter of his existing financial obligations. What kind of obligations? Well, he's been making these erratic, large payments that we'll need to reverse, Susan explained. The money he sent for your apartment, the educational expenses, all those monthly transfers. We'll have to recover those funds to ensure his care is properly funded. They were planning to steal back every penny Harold had ever sent to help me, claiming it was necessary for his medical expenses. David leaned forward conspiratorially. We'll also need to review his current will. Documents signed during periods of mental incompetence can be challenged in court. You think his will should be changed? Obviously, the current version was influenced by his cognitive problems, Susan said. Leaving the majority of his estate to someone outside the immediate family doesn't make sense for a man in his condition. Outside the immediate family, they were talking about me, Harold's granddaughter, as if I were a stranger trying to steal from him. What would a more appropriate will look like? I asked, though I dreaded hearing the answer. David smiled with satisfaction. Something that reflects his true wishes before the dementia set in. Natural family inheritance, with the primary assets going to his children who can manage them responsibly. They wanted to inherit everything and leave me with nothing after years of systematically stealing money Harold had sent for my support. I'm curious about something, I said, taking a sip of my latte to buy time while formulating my next question. If Harold's condition has been getting worse for over a year, how were you able to manage the financial support he was sending me? Susan and David exchanged a quick look, and I saw David's jaw clench with tension. That's actually part of the problem, David said slowly. We were trying to protect you from his erratic behavior by managing those funds ourselves. So, when he sent money for my apartment or medical expenses, you were screening those payments. We had to, Susan said, her voice taking on a defensive edge. He was sending amounts that didn't make sense for purposes that seemed suspicious. Suspicious how? David leaned back in his chair, and I could see him calculating how much to reveal. He was claiming you had medical emergencies that we knew weren't real, talking about educational expenses for classes you weren't taking. We realized his confused mental state was making him vulnerable to manipulation. The breathtaking hypocrisy was stunning. They were accusing Harold of being confused about expenses they had fabricated themselves to justify stealing his money. Who did you think was manipulating him? I asked. We weren't sure, Susan said. Maybe someone at his bank, or a caregiver, or even one of his business associates. Elder financial abuse is very common. They were projecting their own crimes onto imaginary villains, while positioning themselves as Harold's protectors. David checked his watch and seemed to reach a decision. Valerie, there's something else we need to discuss. The guardianship hearing is scheduled for this afternoon, and we need you to testify about Harold's recent erratic behavior. What would I need to say? Just confirm that you witnessed his confused state at the restaurant, his wild accusations, his paranoid behavior toward family members. Susan explained. Nothing dramatic, just honest testimony about what you observed. They wanted me to commit perjury under oath to help them steal Harold's life and assets. And after the hearing, I asked, we can start making arrangements for his care, David said. The facility in Westchester has an opening next week. We want to get him transferred while his condition is still manageable. Next week. They were planning to have Harold locked away within days. I have one more question, I said, reaching for my purse to signal that our conversation was ending. What if I decide I can't support the guardianship petition? The change in my parents' demeanor was immediate and chilling. David's friendly expression hardened into something cold and threatening. That would be very disappointing, he said quietly, and very foolish. Susan leaned forward with false concern. Sweetheart, you're not thinking clearly right now. The stress of Harold's condition has been overwhelming for all of us. But if you try to interfere with what needs to be done, David continued, you'll be working against Harold's best interests and against your own family. The threat was unmistakable. If I oppose their plans, they would consider me an enemy to be dealt with accordingly. I understand, I said, standing up and shouldering my purse. I need to think about everything we've discussed. As I walked toward the coffee shop exit, I heard David call after me. Remember, Valerie family loyalty works both ways. We hope we can count on your support this afternoon. The recording device in my purse had captured every word of their conspiracy, including their plans to commit perjury, steal Harold's assets, and imprison him in a nursing facility where his protests would be ignored. But more importantly, it had captured their threats against me for considering opposition to their scheme. Margaret Chen was going to find this recording very interesting indeed. I sat in the courthouse hallway at 2 in the afternoon, watching my parents confer nervously with their attorney while they waited for the guardianship hearing to begin. They kept glancing in my direction, clearly anxious about whether I would support their petition as promised. They had no idea that in the room behind me, Margaret Chen was presenting our evidence to the district attorney, the FBI Financial Crimes Unit, and a judge who had already issued arrest warrants based on the recording I had made that morning. The coffee shop conversation had provided everything law enforcement needed to file federal charges for elder abuse fraud conspiracy and attempted theft of assets exceeding $10 million. David's threats against me had elevated the charges to include intimidation of a witness in a federal investigation. Valerie Mitchell. A bailiff approached me with official papers. You're requested in conference room B. I followed him down the corridor, passing my parents, who assumed I was being called to give testimony supporting their guardianship petition. David nodded encouragingly, while Susan gave me what she probably thought was a reassuring smile. Conference Room B contained more law enforcement officials than I had ever seen in one place. Margaret Chen sat at the head of a polished wooden table flanked by federal agents, assistant district attorneys, and representatives from the state's Elder Abuse Prevention Unit. Ms. Mitchell, said Agent Sarah Rodriguez from the FBI's Financial Crimes Division, your recording this morning provided crucial evidence for multiple federal charges against your parents. We're ready to proceed with arrests. Through the conference room window, I could see Harold being wheeled into the courthouse in a hospital wheelchair, accompanied by his personal physician and a court-appointed medical advocate. His doctor had cleared him for limited activity specifically to attend these proceedings. How is my grandfather doing? I asked. Better than anyone expected, Margaret replied. Once we removed him from the stress of your parents' manipulation, his heart condition stabilized dramatically. His cardiologist believes he could live several more years with proper care. Agent Rodriguez opened a thick file containing the evidence we had compiled. Your parents' financial crimes go back 6 years and total over $400,000 in theft. We've also identified the loan shark operation they owe money to, which explains their desperation to access your grandfather's estate. What happens now? I asked. In about 10 minutes, your parents will be arrested in the courthouse hallway, Margaret explained. The guardianship petition will be dismissed, and Harold will be free to return home with appropriate security measures in place. Through the window, I watched Harold speaking quietly with his medical advocate. Despite everything he had endured, his posture was dignified and his expression alert. The supposed cognitive decline my parents had described was nowhere to be seen. Agent Rodriguez handed me a document. We'll need your formal testimony for the trial, but the recording provides enough evidence for conviction, even if your parents refuse to cooperate. Will they go to prison? I asked. Federal elder abuse charges carry mandatory minimum sentences, Margaret replied. David will likely receive 5 to 7 years, Susan, 3 to 5. They'll also be required to pay full restitution, though, given their financial situation, recovery will require seizing their assets. I thought about the BMW my parents had bought with money meant for my apartment, the European vacation funded by Harold's generosity, the designer clothes purchased while I ate instant noodles for dinner. There's something else you need to know, Margaret continued. Harold wants to speak with you privately before we proceed. She led me to another conference room where my grandfather was waiting alone, his color much improved from the pale, exhausted man I had seen in the hospital. Valerie, he said, standing carefully and embracing me, I owe you an enormous apology. You don't owe me anything, I protested. I should apologize for my parents' behavior. Harold shook his head firmly. I failed you by allowing their deception to continue. I should have insisted on communicating with you directly instead of trusting them as intermediaries. He walked to the window, overlooking the courthouse plaza, his hands clasped behind his back. For 6 years, I thought I was helping you build independence and financial security. Instead, I was enabling their theft while you struggled unnecessarily. You were trying to help me in a way that preserved my dignity, I said. That's not failure, that's love. Harold turned back toward me, tears in his eyes. I have perhaps 2 years left according to my doctors. I want to spend that time getting to know my granddaughter properly, without lies or intermediaries. I'd like that too, I said, surprised by the emotion in my own voice. There's something else, Harold said, reaching into his jacket pocket. I've made some changes to my will that I want you to understand. He handed me a legal document dated just 3 days earlier. According to the new terms, I would inherit not just Harold's financial assets, but also controlling interest in the Harold Mitchell Foundation, a charitable organization focused on preventing elder abuse and supporting young adults aging out of difficult family situations. I want you to carry on work that matters, Harold explained. Use the foundation to help people who are trapped in situations like yours where family members exploit their trust and steal their futures. The responsibility felt overwhelming but also purposeful in a way I had never experienced. "What about my parents?" I asked. Harold's expression grew sad but determined. "They made their choices, and now they must face the consequences. I hope prison will give them time to understand the harm they've caused and find a way to become better people." A knock on the conference room door interrupted our conversation. Margaret Chen entered with Agent Rodriguez and several other officials. "Oh, it's time," Margaret said quietly. Through the conference room window, we watched federal agents approach my parents in the courthouse hallway. I saw the exact moment when Susan and David realized they weren't being called to testify in support of their guardianship petition. David became belligerent as the handcuffs were applied, shouting about his rights and demanding to speak with his attorney. Susan collapsed into sobs, covering her face with her hands as she was led away. "I know this is difficult," Harold said, placing his hand on my shoulder, "but you saved my life by having the courage to expose their crimes." Over the next 6 months, the legal proceedings unfolded exactly as Margaret had predicted. David and Susan pleaded guilty to federal charges rather than face trial, accepting prison sentences in exchange for cooperating with the government's investigation into the loan shark operation they had been involved with. The day after their sentencing, Harold and I had lunch at a small restaurant near his apartment, the first of many such meals we would share. We talked about his business empire, his philanthropic goals, and his hopes for the foundation that would carry on his legacy. "I have a confession to make," Harold said as we finished our coffee. "I've been secretly proud of you every day since your college graduation. Your work ethic, your determination to succeed independently, your kindness toward others despite your own struggles. Those qualities had nothing to do with money, and everything to do with the person you chose to become." I realized that my grandfather's greatest gift hadn't been the financial support I never knew about. It had been believing in my worth even when my own parents were willing to steal my future for their selfish gain. 1 year later, I stood in the boardroom of the Harold Mitchell Foundation, addressing a group of social workers, legal advocates, and financial investigators who had gathered for our annual conference on elder abuse prevention. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, I could see the Manhattan skyline stretching toward the horizon, a reminder of how far I had traveled from that devastating birthday dinner. "Family relationships built on deception and exploitation aren't worth preserving," I told the audience. "Sometimes the most loving thing we can do is hold our relatives accountable for their harmful actions, even when it's painful." The foundation had helped secure justice for over 200 elder abuse victims in its first year, providing legal support, financial investigation services, and emergency housing for seniors whose families had betrayed their trust. Harold sat in the front row, his health much improved after removing the stress of my parents' manipulation from his life. The doctors had revised their prognosis upward several times, suggesting he might have many more years ahead of him. After my presentation, I joined Harold for our weekly dinner at his favorite restaurant, the same establishment where my birthday celebration had revealed the devastating truth about my family, but which now held different memories of honest conversations and shared plans for the future. "I've been thinking about your parents lately," Harold said as we reviewed the Foundation's latest case reports. "Do you ever wonder if they've learned anything from their experience in prison?" "I hope they have," I replied honestly. "But I also know that forgiveness doesn't require me to trust them again or welcome them back into our lives." Harold nodded thoughtfully. "True family is built on honesty, respect, and genuine care for each other's well-being. Blood relationships that lack those qualities aren't really family at all." As we finished dinner and prepared to leave, Harold handed me an envelope containing tickets to a Broadway show we had been planning to attend together. "Next week will mark 2 years since that terrible birthday dinner," he said. "I thought we should create some better memories to associate with the date." Walking out of the restaurant together, I reflected on how completely my life had changed since discovering my parents' betrayal. The foundation work was challenging but meaningful. My relationship with Harold was everything I had never known I was missing, and I had learned to distinguish between people who claimed to love me and people who actually demonstrated love through their actions. Sometimes the most devastating betrayals clear the path toward the most authentic relationships. Learning that my parents had been lying to me for years was heartbreaking, but it also freed me to build a real family with someone who genuinely valued my happiness over his own convenience. The money Harold left me would eventually provide financial security I had never imagined possible. But his greater gift was teaching me that my worth didn't depend on anyone else's opinion, generosity, or approval. I had spent years believing I was failing at independence while secretly being supported by my grandfather's love. Now I understood that true independence isn't about refusing help when it's offered honestly. It's about having the strength to reject manipulation disguised as assistance and the wisdom to recognize authentic care when it appears. As Harold and I walked through the Manhattan evening toward his apartment, I realized this was what genuine family looked like. Two people who chose to support each other's dreams, celebrate each other's achievements, and face life's challenges together without hidden agendas or secret resentments. The foundation's work would continue long after Harold was gone, helping other families navigate the complex dynamics of trust, money, and loyalty that had nearly destroyed our relationship. Every case we resolved successfully honored the painful lessons we had learned about the difference between people who use love as a weapon and people who offer it as a gift. My parents had taught me what family isn't. Harold taught me what family could be when built on a foundation of honesty, respect, and mutual support. That was a lesson worth more than any inheritance. Have you ever discovered that someone you trusted was lying to you about something important? How did you find the strength to confront the truth and protect yourself from further harm? Please share your thoughts in the comments below, and if this story resonated with you, please like this video and subscribe for more true stories about overcoming family betrayal and finding authentic relationships. Share this story with anyone who might need to hear that they deserve honesty and genuine care from the people in their lives. Thank you for joining me on this journey from heartbreak to healing. Remember that recognizing manipulation isn't betraying family loyalty. It's honoring your own worth and protecting your future. I hope you find the courage to demand the authentic love you deserve and the wisdom to recognize it when it appears.